The studio buzzed with anticipation as Stephen Colbert leaned forward in his chair, his signature smirk barely concealing the sharp glint in his eyes. Across from him sat Elon Musk, the tech titan whose every word seemed to ripple across the globe. The audience, primed for the usual blend of wit and banter, had no idea they were about to witness a collision that would dominate headlines. Tonight's episode of the talk show, a platform known for dissecting celebrity conversations with a razor's edge, promised to be different. But what could push these two giants, one of comedy and one of industry, to the brink? Was it a clash, of egos, a misstep in the dance of public personas, or something deeper, something tied to the pulse of the world outside the studio? The conversation began innocently enough. Colbert, ever the master of steering dialogue, lobbed soft questions about Musk's latest ventures. The guest responded with his trademark blend of audacity and nonchalance, outlining plans that sounded more like science fiction than reality. The audience laughed, applauded, and leaned in, captivated by the vision of a man who seemed to live a decade ahead of everyone else. Yet beneath the surface, a tension simmered. Colbert's questions grew sharper, probing not just the what, but the why. Why push so hard? Why gamble so much? The host's tone carried an edge, a subtle challenge that hinted at skepticism. Musk, usually unflappable, began to shift in his seat, his answers clipped, his eyes narrowing. The topic soon veered into treacherous territory, the influence of technology on society. Colbert, with his knack for wrapping critique in humor, began to press Musk on the societal cost of his ambitions. He referenced recent debates swirling around artificial intelligence, automation, and the concentration of power in the hands of a few. The host's words were careful but pointed, suggesting that Musk's innovations might be outpacing humanity's ability to grapple with their consequences. Was this progress, Colbert mused aloud, or was it recklessness dressed up as genius? The audience, sensing the shift, grew quieter, their laughter replaced by murmurs. Musk's smile faded, replaced by a steely gaze that seemed to size up his opponent. What had started as a playful exchange was now a tightrope walk. Colbert, emboldened by the crowd's reactions, pushed further, questioning the ethics of unchecked innovation. He brought up recent public outcries over job losses tied to automation, painting a picture of workers left behind in the wake of technological upheaval. The host's voice rose, his gestures animated, as he leaned into the role of the everyman's advocate. Musk, however, was no stranger to criticism. His responses grew terse, each word a calculated counterpunch. He defended his vision, arguing that stagnation was the true enemy, that humanity's survival depended on bold leaps forward. The air crackled with their clashing convictions, each man digging in, neither willing to yield. As the segment neared its close, the tension boiled over. Colbert, perhaps sensing an opportunity to land a memorable moment, made a quip about billionaires playing God, while ordinary people paid the price. The jab was meant to sting, and it did. Musk's face hardened, his jaw tightening as the audience gasped. For a moment, silence gripped the studio, the weight of the insult hanging in the air. What would Musk do? Would he laugh it off, deflect, or strike back? The guest leaned forward, his voice low but laced with venom, and delivered a retort that cut deeper than Colbert's jab. It wasn't just a defense, it was an accusation, one that turned the host's moral posturing on its head. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others stunned as the show cut to commercial. The battle lines were drawn, and this was only the beginning.
Hey, whether you're Team Musk's or Team Colbert, make sure to subscribe and grab some more content.
The studio lights dimmed as the show returned from commercial, but the atmosphere remained charged, as if the air itself held the echo of Musk's biting retort. Stephen Colbert, usually quick to regain control with a quip or a grin, seemed momentarily off balance, his smile tight. The audience, still buzzing from the verbal sparring, leaned forward, sensing that the exchange was far from over. Elon Musk sat back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked on the host, daring him to escalate. The talk show, known for its incisive commentary on celebrity interactions, had stumbled into a raw, unscripted showdown and neither man was backing down. Colbert, ever the professional, pivoted to a lighter topic, attempting to diffuse the tension with a question about Musk's public persona. He teased the guest about his knack for stirring controversy online, framing it as a playful jab at Musk's larger-than-life presence. But the attempt at levity fell flat. Musk, still simmering from the earlier insult, answered with a pointed edge, suggesting that Colbert's own platform thrived on manufactured outrage. The response wasn't just defensive, it was an attack, implying that the host was no stranger to exploiting controversy for ratings. The audience murmured, some laughing nervously, others shifting uncomfortably as the jab landed. Undeterred, Colbert leaned into the challenge, his tone growing sharper. He steered the conversation toward a recent wave of public backlash against tech moguls, particularly Musk's outspoken views on free speech and regulation. The host framed his questions as a defense of accountability, pressing Musk on whether his influence had outgrown the checks and balances of a democratic society. Colbert's words were laced with a moral undertone, painting Musk as a figure whose ambitions bordered on hubris. The audience, caught between admiration for the host's boldness and unease at the escalating confrontation, began to fracture. Some clapped, others whispered, unsure where their loyalties lay. Musk, however, was ready for the fight. His responses grew more forceful, each one a rebuttal to Colbert's insinuations. He argued that innovation required freedom, that bureaucracy and fear-mongering stifled progress. His voice, steady but intense, carried a conviction that resonated with those in the crowd who saw him as a visionary. Yet, there was an undercurrent of disdain in his tone, a suggestion that Colbert's critiques were rooted in envy or ignorance. The guest's words weren't just a defense of his work. They were a challenge to the host's credibility, a subtle accusation that Colbert was posturing for clout rather than engaging in good faith. The exchange reached a fever pitch when Colbert, perhaps sensing the audience's divided energy, doubled down. He referenced a recent scandal involving one of Musk's companies, a murky affair that had fueled public skepticism about corporate overreach. The host's tone was biting, his questions framed to cast doubt on Musk's integrity. It was a calculated move designed to put the guest on the defensive and reclaim the upper hand. But Musk didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze piercing, and unleashed a response that was as calculated as it was ruthless. He accused Colbert of cherry-picking scandals to fit a narrative, of hiding behind comedy to dodge real accountability. The guest's words were sharp, laced with a rudeness that stunned the room. A direct insult to Colbert's journalistic pretense. The audience gasped, then erupted into a mix of cheers and boos, the sound swallowing the studio. Colbert's face flushed, his composure cracking for a split second before he forced a laugh. The show cut to another break, the tension unresolved, the crowd electric with anticipation. Musk had drawn blood, and the host was wounded. But the night was far from over. The commercial break did little to cool the inferno that had engulfed the studio. As the cameras rolled again, Stephen Colbert adjusted his tie, his smile a thin veneer over the sting of Elon Musk's earlier insult. The audience, still reeling from the guest's audacious takedown, buzzed with a mix of excitement and unease, their divided reactions fueling the talk show's reputation for unfiltered drama. Musk, seated with an air of quiet defiance, seemed almost amused, his eyes glinting with the confidence of a man who thrived in chaos. The stage was set for another round, and the question hung heavy. Could Colbert regain control, or would Musk's unrelenting edge dominate the night? Colbert, determined to reassert his authority, shifted tactics. He leaned into his comedic roots, launching into a monologue that poked fun at Musk's larger-than-life persona. The host painted the guest as a futuristic showman, a man whose grand promises sometimes outran reality. The audience laughed, grateful for the momentary levity, but the jabs carried a pointed subtext, questioning whether Musk's vision was grounded in substance or spectacle. Colbert's delivery was polished, his timing impeccable. Yet there was a desperation beneath it, a need to reclaim the narrative after Musk's earlier blow. The host was playing to the crowd, banking on their loyalty to pull him through. Musk, however, was not one to be upstaged. His responses were measured but laced with a biting wit that matched Colbert's. He countered the host's mockery by turning it back, suggesting that comedy, like technology, could be a tool for distraction rather than truth. The guests' words were a subtle dig, implying that Colbert's humor was less about insight and more about pandering. The audience, torn between the two, responded with scattered applause, some siding with Musk's defiance, others rallying behind Colbert's charm. The dynamic was shifting, the power balance teetering as each man fought to sway the room. The conversation took a darker turn when Colbert, emboldened by the crowd's laughter, pressed Musk on a recent controversy tied to labor practices at one of his companies. The host's questions were relentless, framed to cast Musk as indifferent to the human cost of his empire. He referenced viral stories of worker discontent, weaving them into a broader critique of unchecked capitalism. Colbert's tone was righteous, his words designed to provoke both Musk and the audience, to spark a reaction that would cement his moral high ground. It was a risky move, one that could either solidify his dominance or backfire spectacularly. Musk's demeanor shifted, his calm facade giving way to a controlled but palpable anger. He didn't deny the allegations outright, but instead challenged their framing, accusing Colbert of sensationalizing complex issues for applause. His voice was steady, but the edge in it was unmistakable, a warning that the host was treading on dangerous ground. The guest's rebuttal was a masterclass in redirection, flipping the narrative to question Colbert's own platform. He suggested that the talk show thrived on outrage, profiting from the same societal fractures it claimed to critique. The accusation landed like a thunderclap, the audience erupting in a chaotic mix of cheers and gasps. Colbert, caught off guard by the ferocity of Musk's counterattack, struggled to maintain his composure. His next question faltered, his usual wit dulled by the guest's unrelenting pressure. The studio felt smaller, the air thicker as the confrontation reached a new peak. Musk had once again turned the tables, exposing the cracks in Colbert's armor. As the segment ended, the host signaled for another break, his face a mask of forced calm. The audience, now fully invested, roared with anticipation, knowing the clash was far from resolved. The studio hummed with raw energy as the show resumed, the audience's fervor undimmed by the brief pause. Stephen Colbert, his confidence shaken but not broken, sat straighter, his eyes flickering with a mix of determination and unease. Elon Musk, by contrast, exuded a predator's calm, his earlier verbal strikes having tilted the battlefield in his favor. The talk show, a crucible for dissecting celebrity exchanges, had become a gladiatorial arena, and the crowd was ravenous for the next blow. Colbert's challenge now was not just to spar, but to survive a guest who seemed to anticipate his every move. Colbert, sensing the need to shift the tide, pivoted to a new angle. He leaned into a topic that had gripped public discourse, the role of billionaires in shaping global policy. With a calculated smile, he questioned Musk's influence, probing whether one man's vision, however bold, should hold such sway over humanity's future. The host's tone was measured, but the subtext was clear. He was framing Musk as a self-appointed overlord, accountable to no one. The audience, still split in their allegiances, responded with cautious applause, some nodding at Colbert's populist stance, others waiting for Musk's inevitable counter. Musk's response was a slow burn, his words deliberate, each one chosen, to dismantle Colbert's narrative. He argued that influence was earned, not seized, and that his work was driven by necessity, not ego. His voice carried a quiet intensity, a conviction that silenced the room as he spoke of humanity's precarious future. But then, in a flash of calculated aggression, he turned the lens on Colbert. He suggested that the host's platform, with its millions of viewers, wielded its own unchecked power, shaping opinions under the guise of entertainment. The accusation was a gut punch, implying that Colbert was no different from the elites he critiqued. The audience erupted, the sound a chaotic blend of support and dissent. Colbert's face tightened, his usual quick wit faltering under the weight of Musk's words. The host tried to pivot, tossing out a humorous deflection about talk shows versus tech empires, but the laugh it drew was hollow. Musk's point had landed, and the crowd could sense it. Emboldened, Colbert doubled down, his voice rising as he challenged Musk on recent criticisms of his public behavior, tweets, interviews, and offhand remarks that had sparked outrage. The host painted a picture of recklessness, suggesting that Musk's words carried consequences he refused to own. The confrontation reached a boiling point when Colbert, in a moment of unchecked frustration, let slip a biting remark about Musk's ego being the real fuel behind his empire. The insult was personal, cutting deeper than the host's earlier jabs, and the audience gasped, sensing a line crossed. Musk's eyes narrowed, his silence more menacing than any retort. Then, with a voice cold and precise, he fired back, accusing Colbert of hypocrisy, of preaching humility while basking in the spotlight of his own stage. The guest's words were laced with a rudeness that shocked the room, a deliberate jab that framed Colbert as a performer whose moralizing was just. Another act. The studio exploded in a cacophony of cheers, boos, and stunned murmurs. Colbert, visibly rattled, struggled to regain his footing, his smile strained as he signaled for another break. The audience, now fully ensnared by the drama, leaned forward, their emotions tethered to the escalating war. Musk had once again seized the upper hand, leaving Colbert exposed and the show teetering on the edge of chaos. The question now was not just who would win, but how much further this battle could go. The studio pulsed with a restless energy as the cameras flickered back to life. The audience's fervor now a living thing, feeding off the unrelenting clash between Stephen Colbert and Elon Musk. The host, his composure fraying at the edges, gripped the arm of his chair, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt beneath his practiced charm. Musk, meanwhile, sat with an almost imperceptible smirk, his earlier verbal assault having carved a deep wound in Colbert's armor. The talk show, a beacon for dissecting the raw undercurrents of celebrity exchanges, had become a crucible of pride and power, and the crowd was all in, their emotions tethered to every word. Colbert, aware that his command of the stage was slipping, opted for a bold gambit. He steered the conversation toward a topic that had ignited fierce public debate, the ethical boundaries of artificial intelligence. With a tone that blended curiosity and accusation, he pressed Musk on the risks of unchecked AI development, citing recent fears about its potential to disrupt societies or even outstrip human control. The host's questions were sharp, designed to cast Musk as a reckless pioneer, gambling with forces too vast for one man to wield. The audience, sensing the stakes, leaned in, their murmurs a mix of awe and unease. Musk's response was a masterclass in controlled defiance. He acknowledged the risks, but framed them as challenges to be met, not reasons to retreat. His voice, steady and commanding, painted a vision of AI as a tool for human ascension, not destruction. But then, in a calculated pivot, he turned the tables. He questioned Colbert's selective outrage, suggesting that the host's platform thrived on fear-driven narratives, amplifying panic for profit. The accusation was a dagger, implying that Colbert was less a truth-seeker than a peddler of sensationalism. The audience erupted, some cheering Musk's audacity, others bristling at the attack on their host. Colbert, stung but unwilling to yield, pushed back harder. His voice rose, laced with a righteous edge, as he challenged Musk on the human toll of his relentless pace. Communities disrupted, workers displaced, all in the name of progress. The host's words were a rallying cry, an appeal to the audience's sense of fairness, and for a moment he seemed to regain the room. The crowd clapped, some shouting encouragement, their loyalty to Colbert's everyman persona rekindled. But the victory was fleeting. Musk, undeterred, leaned forward, his gaze piercing, and delivered a retort that cut through the noise like a blade. The guest accused Colbert of moral grandstanding, of using the plight of workers as a prop to mask his own complicity in a media machine that profited from division. The words were brutal, laced with a condescension that bordered on cruelty, and they landed with devastating precision. The audience gasped, the sound swallowed by a wave of stunned silence. Colbert's face froze, his usual quick wit buried under the weight of Musk's attack. The host's attempt to laugh it off fell flat, his voice strained as the crowd's energy shifted, some now openly siding with the guest's unrelenting candor. The segment ended abruptly, Colbert signaling for a break with a hand that trembled slightly. The studio was a cauldron of emotion, anger, awe, and anticipation swirling together. Musk had not just wounded Colbert, he had exposed the fragility of the host's carefully crafted persona. The audience, their hearts racing, knew the confrontation was nearing its climax. The only question left was how Colbert would respond to a guest who had turned his own stage against him. The studio crackled with an almost unbearable tension as the show roared back from its break, the audience's anticipation now a tangible force pressing against the walls. Stephen Colbert, his face a mask of forced composure, sat rigid, his fingers tapping an unsteady rhythm on his desk. The wounds from Elon Musk's relentless verbal onslaught were visible in the tightness of his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Musk, by contrast, radiated an unshakable calm, his posture relaxed but his gaze predatory, as if he knew the stage was his. The talk show, a crucible for raw celebrity confrontations, had reached a breaking point, and the crowd was poised for the fallout, their emotions a tangled mix of loyalty and exhilaration. Colbert, desperate to reclaim his footing, launched into a new line of attack. He pivoted to the topic of public trust, questioning whether Musk's outsized influence, on everything from markets to mines, had eroded faith in institutions. The host's voice was steady, but laced with a barely concealed anger, his words framing Musk as a disruptor, whose actions bordered on reckless. He referenced recent uproars over Musk's public statements, painting them as divisive, even dangerous. The audience, still reeling from the earlier exchanges, responded with cautious applause, some clinging to Colbert's appeal to accountability, others wary of his increasingly personal tone. Musk, unfazed, met the challenge head-on. His responses were crisp, each one a rebuttal that turned Colbert's accusations into fuel for his own narrative. He argued that trust was earned through action, not conformity, and that his willingness to speak freely was a strength, not a flaw. The guest's voice carried a quiet authority, a conviction that resonated with those in the crowd who saw him as a rebel against a stifling status quo. But then, in a move that electrified the room, Musk went further. He accused Colbert of pandering to a system that rewarded conformity over truth, of hiding behind his desk while pretending to challenge power. The jab was vicious, a direct assault on the host's integrity, and it sparked a roar from the audience, some cheering, others gasping. Colbert, his patience fraying, snapped. His voice rose, sharp and uncharacteristically raw, as he accused Musk of arrogance, of treating the world as his personal playground. The host's words were a gamble, an attempt to rally the crowd by casting himself as the voice of reason against a rogue titan. For a moment it seemed to work. The audience clapped, their cheers swelling as Colbert leaned into his role as their champion. But the triumph was short-lived. Musk, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and disdain, leaned forward and delivered a response that was as devastating as it was precise. The guest dismantled Colbert's outburst, calling it a tantrum disguised as principle. He suggested with a cutting edge that the host's anger stemmed not from conviction but from fear of being exposed as a performer whose relevance depended on the very elites he claimed to critique. The words were a masterstroke, rude in their bluntness yet piercing in their truth, and they left the studio in stunned silence. Colbert's face flushed, his hands clenching as he struggled to respond. The audience, now fully in Musk's thrall, erupted in a chaotic mix of cheers and murmurs, their allegiance shifting to the guest who had turned the host's stage into a battlefield. The segment ended with Colbert, visibly shaken, calling for a final break. The studio was a maelstrom of emotion, the crowd's energy a testament to the confrontation's raw power. Musk had not just bested Colbert, he had stripped away the host's veneer, leaving him vulnerable on his own turf. The stage was set for a final reckoning, one that would determine who would emerge triumphant. The studio was a furnace of emotion as the final segment began, the audience's fervor reaching a fever pitch after the relentless war of words between Stephen Colbert and Elon Musk. The host, his pride battered and his stage all but commandeered, sat with a forced smile, his eyes burning with a mix of defiance and desperation. Musk, by contrast, exuded an almost serene confidence, his earlier verbal victories having cemented his dominance. The talk show, a lightning rod for dissecting celebrity clashes, had become a spectacle of raw human conflict, and the crowd was ravenous for the conclusion, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Colbert, knowing this was his last chance to salvage his dignity, launched into a final offensive. He leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury, and challenged Musk on the legacy of his ambitions. The host questioned whether Musk's relentless drive would leave the world better, or merely more chaotic, framing the guest as a man whose vision outstripped his accountability. It was a poignant appeal, one that tapped into the audience's lingering doubts about unchecked power. For a moment, the room seemed to rally behind Colbert, their applause swelling as he positioned himself as the voice of caution in a world hurtling toward the unknown. Musk, however, was ready for the endgame. His response was measured, almost philosophical, as he spoke of progress as a collective necessity, not a personal crusade. He acknowledged the messiness of change, but argued that retreat was not an option, not for him, not for humanity. The guest's words were a rallying cry, a call to embrace the future rather than fear it, and they struck a chord with the audience, their cheers drowning out the earlier support for Colbert. But Musk wasn't done. Sensing the moment, he turned the spotlight back on the host with a final devastating strike. In a voice that was both calm and merciless, Musk accused Colbert of cowardice, of using his platform to snipe from the sidelines, while contributing nothing to the solutions he demanded. The guest's words were a public undressing, rude in their directness, but searing in their accuracy, as he suggested that Colbert's outrage was a performance, a way to mask his own irrelevance, in a world that demanded action. The audience gasped, then exploded into a cacophony of cheers and stunned silence, the sound a testament to Musk's triumph. Colbert's face crumpled, his attempt at a rebuttal lost in the roar of the crowd, his authority shattered on his own stage. The host, his voice barely audible, made a final desperate move. He rose from his chair, his gesture abrupt, and declared the segment over, effectively ejecting Musk from the set. The audience booed, their loyalty now firmly with the guest who had outmaneuvered their host at every turn. Musk stood, his expression one of quiet satisfaction, and exited the stage to thunderous applause, leaving Colbert alone under the harsh studio lights. The host forced a laugh, his parting words drowned out by the crowd's fervor, but the damage was done. Musk had not just won, he had humiliated Colbert, turning the talk show into a monument to his own unyielding resolve. As the cameras cut, the audience rose, their cheers a celebration of the guest who had faced a titan and emerged victorious. The show ended not with Colbert's usual charm, but with the raw, triumphant energy of a man who had refused to bend. For the viewers at home, the story was complete, a searing, emotional journey from tension to triumph, with Musk as the undeniable victor, his exit a final rebuke to a host who had dared to challenge him.